and welcome back to Book and Page. We are on to part 8, or the second to last part of Sir Gawain the Green Knight. We are finally going to end the storyline we started, despite that bit in the middle where everything went a little haywire. Maybe that's gonna make sense. In the conclusion, we're not quite there yet. We still gotta get Gawain to the Green Chapel. So, as always, we'll do a brief summary about what happened in this part of the book, and then we'll talk a little more deeper about what we've actually seen. Let's get started. So, the night is full of howling winter wind, and Gawain cannot sleep. Turns out he's a little focused on that whole probably gonna die tomorrow thing. I think we can understand that. So, he makes the decision to go ahead and get up before dawn even breaks, and calls for people to help him get dressed and get his horse saddled, which they happily do. Why are these people awake at this time? Gawain is careful not to forget that green girdle he was given that will hopefully help him survive this ordeal. In fact, he wears it quite happily over everything. It's a good thing, Gawain, that you're not meeting the Lord of this castle before you're leaving, all things considered. I won't tell him about this, wears it very obviously while still in the Lord's castle. And then he starts his adventure, hops on his horse, commands the household and its inhabitants to God, and leaves with a single guide to show him the way. The guide leads him up into the hills. Everything is very misty, it's snowy, it's winter. Gawain's probably having flashbacks of how terrible the start of this winter was before he actually found the house that he was very happy to be in. And then the guide stops him and has this brief exchange of, please don't do this, you should run away. This area has a dude in here who likes to hurt people. Please don't do this, we all really like you. To which Gawain very properly responds that he cannot in fact play the coward here. He is a knight and he needs to do the knightly thing, which is to face death in the face and take an axe to the neck. Yay? The guide accepts this, says that he himself won't go any further because he doesn't want to die, and then gives Gawain his last instructions to get to the Green Chapel, which is to head on down into the valley and to the left. Gawain thanks him for this, the guide heads off, and Gawain heads on down into the valley to meet with his fate. Apparently he was looking for an actual church, because as he heads into the valley and finds just nature and this round mound, which could be representative of a burial mound or a fairy mound. Sometimes those two things are the same thing. And Gawain's like, well, turns out I'm not looking for a church of God, I've probably found the church of the devil. Yay. And then suddenly the entire valley is filled with this screeching, whirling noise, and it turns out the Green Knight is sharpening his axe. Gawain calls out to let him know that he's there, and the Green Knight asks him to wait so he could finish that sharpening before hopping down to join Gawain with his gigantic axe. Very happy to find that Gawain's kept his word. Also maybe a little sinister. Might be a little sinister. I'm feeling it's a little sinister right now. And that's where I've cut it off. Next video will be the end of the game and the end of the text itself. But the journey itself has some interesting parts that we really need to talk about. So we can't go much further now, or we risk losing some very interesting things that are easy to run past when you're aiming for, I want to see Gawain lose his head. Or I want to see Gawain avoid losing his head somehow. So, let's talk about a few things. Gawain not being able to sleep is extremely normal. he is in a perilous situation. How many of us have had something very scary that we had to face up to the next day, or something even exciting but different? You're not usually sleeping well. But the fact is that nature seems to be reflecting this in the story. The fact that we've suddenly got this howling wind, and we haven't really been given a sense, since he arrived at this castle, that the weather's really affected anybody. The Lord and his men have happily gone hunting for the past 3 days. They don't seem overly concerned about the fact that there's winter weather happening. But suddenly, Gawain's restless, and so is nature outside. And interestingly enough, while we might have this idea that Gawain is facing down the Green Knight, he also seems to be having this battle with nature itself, where he's going into a very unfamiliar landscape that's either trying to hide things from him, or not at least fully tell him the truth. As he heads up into the hills with the guide, we get a very lovely description of just how much he cannot actually see. They climbed up past rock faces gripped by the cold. The clouds were high up, but murky beneath them. Mist shrouded the moors, melted on the hills. Each summit wore a hat, a huge cloak of mists. Streams foamed and splashed down the slopes around them, breaking white against the banks as they rushed downhill. Very wandering was the way they must take to the wood. So even nature itself seems to match how Gawain's feeling, and then heighten that anxiety as well. He's feeling very restless and very, very nervous, so we have that howling wind while he can't sleep. And then he's heading into the unknown, and again, nature seems to be presenting that fully. All of this mist is concealing what's beyond. And the fact is, they're not taking a straight road. There's no easy way to handle this situation. It's not, hey, stay on this track and you'll be fine. You gotta wander your way in, just like the streams need to wander down the hill, and you have to wander through the mist, which is not a comfortable feeling. So, as Gawain's starting this adventure out, we're having a battle with nature itself, which culminates when he hits the valley where the Green Chapel actually is, and has the sudden realization that he's not going to find a physical church. This is no longer a space where the human has tamed nature. Nature is at its most apparent here, and to Gawain, that's frightening. The sheer number of times he equates this place to hell and the devil, which we'll get to, says that Gawain is used to being in civilization. The fact is that the entire time he's been on this journey, he's suffered the most when he has not been at a court or at a castle. This random castle that appeared to him, and this entire exchange game between a lord and a lady, were a reprieve from the fact that Gawain was suffering badly out in the winter weather prior to finding the castle. So he's now returned to that natural aspect, and it is deeply, deeply foreign to him, and he is uncomfortable. The fact is, when he describes the valley, which I think to a lot of us might have actually been a pretty scene, he is affected by the fact that he has to go here to die, but it should be noted that he is not really prescribing to the idea of via affirmativa, which is the idea that you can find God in everything. That includes nature and other people. When you look at a very pretty scene, in a religious aspect, you can have via affirmativa or via negativa, which is either you look at everything and say God created this and it's good to exist in it because God created it, or you're trying to strip away all of these other bits and pieces because they're all temptations that lead you away from God, which is via negativa. So Gawain, while he doesn't seem to be fully following this idea of via negativa, he's not understanding the valley as something of God's creation. He is deeply, deeply associating it to the devil. Is it a surprise that he's descending into this valley? I don't think it should be. But we've skipped a little ahead, and we need to skip back to face up to the fact that Gawain is wearing this green girdle. And as I said in the summary, very apparently so. The narrator actually tells us that it matches quite well with his surcoat, his red surcoat, which he has the belt tied around. Which means it is a very apparent part of his outfit. He is not trying to hide it in any way. There are two interesting aspects to this. First, the narrator tries to sort of soften the fact that Gawain does this by insisting that he's doing it for his own protection. He's not doing it because he wants to show off how wealthy he is, because it is a very expensive piece, actually embroidered with gold thread. And he's not trying to be prideful and say that he won this as a love token from a lady. The narrator does want to remind you he is doing this in self-defense. But the other issue is that in this description of Gawain getting dressed, the girdle itself seems to replace another important aspect to his suit. He is supposed to be the best dressed man in the world here. That's actually a description that the narrator uses. Yet as he describes all the accoutrements that Gawain has, he forgets one vital thing, which is the shield he spent quite a bit of time describing prior to this point, with the five-pointed star that represents how virtuous and knightly Gawain is, with a picture of Mary on the inside close to Gawain's heart. The fact is, the girl has taken over for the defensive part of Gawain's armor. He no longer seems to need the shield because he's trusting fully in this girdle. Which means, in a lot of ways, despite his fear of going into the devil's church, he seems to have stepped away from his religious protection towards this idea of a more magical, worldly protection, or even a pagan protection. So we're seeing a switch here in Gawain that he himself fails to acknowledge as he heads down into the valley, because he himself might be closer to this landscape than he was prior to this point. But he doesn't want to acknowledge that, simply because he'd have to admit several deep, deep issues within himself. That includes all the temptations that he met with in that castle, and those he failed to meet, such as accepting the green girdle, because he does not want to die. Now, he doesn't seem to abandon his religion fully. He does, again, commend the house to God, and its inhabitants as well. But he does not take the shield with him, or we're at least not told he has it. So his focus isn't on that. He's trusting this belt. Yet, as we look at his journey, we can see some religious comparisons. He has one final temptation out in, well, if we look at the Bible, it might be a desert, but here it's the wilds of the pagan landscape, where he is offered to live if he just runs away. There are some parallels to Jesus' temptations in the desert. And Gawain here does successfully avoid this temptation, but he does so because he trusts he already has a way to survive. He hasn't fully come to terms with being able to let go of this life to move into the next one in his best possible form. But I think we and the narrator should let him off a little bit on this. None of us know how we react in a situation like this. And when you look at it fully, there's no positive outcome from Gawain accepting his own death here. There are plenty of heroes who accept their own death in order to save other people, but that doesn't seem to be what's occurring here. The Green Knight hasn't sworn he's going to kill all of Arthur's court if Gawain doesn't come to meet him. Running away might affect Gawain's own virtue and how people see him, but it's not going to cause any harm to anybody else. At least not directly. Arthur's court might suffer in reputation, but nobody's going to die if Gawain doesn't do this. So suddenly this self-sacrifice doesn't seem to be super useful. So yes, maybe we, like Gawain, would be looking for a way out. And that's the hard thing, right? Because we want Gawain to be a virtuous knight. Because we want to also be able to see ourselves in Gawain. But Gawain is precisely not the best knight of Arthur's court. And in fact, most of the best knights have deep, deep flaws. If you are looking for the perfect religious knight, then you need to look to Galahad and his quest for the Holy Grail. Gawain is not that type of knight. He is a knight who is doing his best. Which is why I think a lot of us can find something of ourselves in Gawain, but why it's also a little hard to accept the fact that he's not going to perform this perfectly. He's a flawed human being. He has fears. He's afraid of death. And this is something we need to learn to accept within him because he is trying. He hasn't run away here. He resists the last temptation and invitation to run because he is trying. And that might be hard for us to accept because a lot of us don't see trying as the point. We see succeeding because trying to us often equates to failure, which is not what it actually is. Trying needs to have an importance in and of itself. Gawain is trying. And we need to try and support him in that, even if it's bringing some of our own faults to the forefront. With that said, let's talk about how just apparent this descent into hell actually is. Now, if you know anything about the hero's journey, or Joseph Campbell's version of the hero's journey, there is usually a descent into hell or the underworld as part of that journey. In something like the Odyssey, that is an actual descent into hell, because he goes to the underworld to speak to the ghosts of the dead. The same thing happens in the Aeneid. Dante's Divine Comedy starts with an entire book, Inferno, that is a literal descent into hell. So it is relatively common to have these descent motifs in epic texts. Some of them, like the ones I just mentioned, are very literal descents into the underworld or into hell. Others aren't as apparent, and then sometimes we need to let that idea of the hero's journey go when that descent isn't happening, because, hey, the hero's journey can still work even if you're not hitting every single one of the beats. That descent is deeply present here in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. It is not a literal descent into the literal underworld, but it is a literal descent into a valley. The fact is, the narrator carefully pairs this descent motif with a direction. He tells Gawain to head down into the valley and to the left. Down and left, within literature, is the direction for hell. Don't ask me how they figured that out, but if you're looking up to God, you look up and to the right. If you're looking down towards hell, you're looking down to the left. Might have something to do with the long-standing belief that I'm hoping we're past of left-handed children being the devil's children. But down to the left is that motif. So if you start seeing people talking about down to the left often, that's a sign we're doing this descent into hell motif that we have from the epic stories. The narrator is not just letting it stand, though. He wants to make it real obvious that we have this descent motif happening. So not only do we have this down and to the left movement, but we have this burial mound happening. It is this round hill. If you go to any place that has these burial mounds, England is a big one, they really just seem to be this bubble coming out of the earth. Sometimes they're longer because they're more oval-shaped rather than circular, but there is a recognized use of them as burial mounds, but there's also a folktale belief that that is also where fairies live, so you're not supposed to go around messing with them, but that is what Christianity would call a pagan belief. So, and they're usually, of course, pre-Christian burial grounds. Usually, I won't say always, I'm not that knowledgeable on the history, but they were usually pre-Christian ones, so they were pagan burial grounds. And they've got this fairy aspect to them. Well, pagan leans a lot more towards devil worship in a lot of views of Christianity than the pagans themselves will tell you, no. You're looking for Satanism on that one, which is different from paganism, which is different from Wiccan. So, down to the left, we've got this round burial fairy mound, and then Gawain and the narrator just open up for just, this is Gawain speaking. "Now truly, said Gawain, this is a desolate place. This chapel looks evil, with grass overgrown. Here fittingly might a man dressed in green perform his devotions in devilish ways. Now all my senses tell me that the devil himself has forced this agreement on me to destroy me. This is a chapel of disaster. May ill luck befall it. It is the most damnable church I've ever been inside." And then we start hearing this terrible grinding stone noise that is associated to a scythe being sharpened, which again is an idea of death. And prior to this point, he does say that the Green Chapel is where the devil has his mountain, says. So, like, 4 times in a very short amount of time, Gawain's just like, devils, damn and hell, and you're just like, okay, Gawain, calm down. But that's sort of that play between the two religions happening, but it's also an extension of Gawain's civilization versus nature thing that we see happening. Because it's not a civilized place, he doesn't find a physical building. And just as a comment to that, if you're like, why would he expect to find a building? You'd be surprised how many churches have just nightly quests inside of them. Including, like, churches that have been taken over by evil forces. So it is something of, like, an accepted motif that you might find an adventure in a church. That's not what's happening. So when he realizes there's no civilized building, there is only this sort of natural landscape with hints of something older and deeper in it. Again, combined with that push and pull between the different religions, and suddenly Gawain is just like, ah! And yet, from there, he has to just hold himself together and call out to the Green Knight. And we get a quick shot at the Vikings. The Green Knight does have a Danish axe. So, a very interesting journey that's combining a lot of motifs into this descent into hell. And next video, we'll get into the game itself, and whether or not the Green Knight can in fact trust Gawain's vows, as he ends this section off saying that he can. So, I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.